There are places the world quietly turns away from, not because they are dangerous, not because they are forbidden, but because they remind people of things they would rather forget. The cabin sat deep in the woods, at the end of a road that no longer showed up on most maps. The gravel thinned out the farther you drove, until it disappeared entirely, replaced by dirt worn down by decades of rain and neglect. Tall trees pressed in from both sides, their branches tangled overhead like clasped hands, blocking out most of the daylight, even at noon. The cabin itself leaned slightly to one side, as if it had grown tired of standing straight. The roof sagged under the weight of years of snow and rot. Several windows were boarded shut, the wood gray and splintered, nailed there long before anyone could remember why. The front door hung crooked on rusted hinges, swelling and shrinking with the seasons until it no longer fit its frame. Locals had names for the place. Some called it the dead cabin. Others referred to it simply as that house, lowering their voices when they did. A few insisted no one had lived there in decades, and that anyone who tried never stayed long. The truth was simpler. No one wanted it. It had been passed over again and again. Realtors barely mentioned it. Buyers drove out once, stood quietly for a few minutes, and then left without asking questions. The cabin carried the unmistakable weight of abandonment. Not dramatic, not violent, just heavy. The kind of heaviness that settles when a place has been forgotten for too long. Tom had not been kind to it. Moss crept along the base of the walls. The porch steps bowed inward, groaning under even the lightest weight. Inside, dust lay thick on the floorboards, undisturbed except for the occasional track left by animals seeking shelter from the cold. The air smelled of damp wood and old paper, a scent that clung to your clothes long after you stepped back outside. People said it wasn't worth fixing. They said it would cost more than it could ever be worth. They said anyone who bought it was throwing money away. And maybe they were right. But there are moments in life when value stops being about comfort or appearances, when the usual rules no longer apply. For someone with options, the cabin was a mistake waiting to happen. For someone with savings, it was a bad investment. For someone with stability, it was an inconvenience. But for someone with nothing left, it was shelter. That was what most people didn't understand. They saw rotting wood and broken windows. They saw isolation and inconvenience. They saw a place that asked too much and offered too little. What they didn't see was silence. What they didn't see was privacy. What they didn't see was the rare chance to start again, far away from the judgment and noise of a world that had already decided who you were. The cabin didn't promise warmth. It didn't promise safety. It didn't promise comfort. It only promised that no one else wanted it. And sometimes, that is exactly why someone chooses to stay. Before the cabin ever entered his life, the man had already learned what it meant to lose things slowly. Not all at once. Not in a way that drew attention, but piece by piece, quietly, until one day he realized there was almost nothing left to let go of. He had not imagined this life for himself. There was a time, long ago enough to feel unreal, when he believed things would follow a predictable path. Work hard, raise a family, grow older together. That was the promise most people were raised on, and for a while it seemed within reach. Then life did what it often does. His wife was gone. The details of how didn't matter as much as the absence she left behind. Some losses come with explanations, others do not. What remained was a silence in the house that never fully went away, no matter how much noise he tried to fill it with. There was a child to care for, a routine to maintain, bills that did not pause for grief. He worked where he could, construction when jobs were available, night shifts when they weren't. Sometimes 2 jobs overlapped and sleep became optional. Sometimes neither called back, and he learned how to stretch what little he had just a bit further. People looked at him differently after a while. Not with cruelty, most of the time, but with that subtle distance reserved for men who remind others of how easily things can fall apart. Friends stopped calling as often. Conversations became shorter. Invitations quieter. He did not blame them. Everyone has their own life to protect. What mattered was his son, a quiet boy, observant, older than his years in the way children become when they grow up watching an adult struggle. He learned early not to ask for much. He learned to wait. He learned to sense when money was tight by the way his father's voice changed at the grocery store. They lived where they could afford. Small places, temporary places, places that never quite felt like home. Each move came with the same promises, just until things get better. And each time, the promise stretched thinner. Rent climbed. Work stayed uncertain. And the savings he once believed would protect them slowly disappeared, used for emergencies that never seemed to end. There came a point when choices narrowed. He could keep paying for a place that was never really theirs, or he could spend what remained on something permanent, no matter how flawed. That was when he saw the listing. A cabin. Remote. Cheap enough to raise suspicion. He stared at the screen longer than he should have. Not because it looked inviting, it didn't, but because it was the first option in years that didn't involve borrowing, begging, or explaining himself to someone else. Ownership meant something to him. Stability meant everything. People later said he was desperate, and maybe he was. But desperation has a way of sharpening priorities. He wasn't looking for comfort. He wasn't looking for approval. He was looking for a place where his son could sleep without wondering if they'd have to leave again. A place where no one could raise the rent. A place where failure didn't come with an eviction notice. By the time he scheduled the visit to see the cabin in person, he already knew what the answer would be. He just didn't yet know why the world had made it so easy for him to say yes. By the time he made the drive back home, the number was already fixed in his mind. It wasn't a large number. It wasn't even enough to make most people feel secure for a few months. It was simply everything he had left. Years earlier, that money had been meant for emergencies. Then emergencies arrived, one after another, and slowly redefined what the word meant. A broken transmission, medical bills that insurance only half covered, weeks without steady work. Each time, he told himself it was temporary. Each time, he took a little more from what was supposed to protect them. Now, what remained sat quietly in his account, doing nothing but reminding him how thin the margin had become. He went over the numbers late at night, long after his son had fallen asleep. The kitchen light stayed on while the rest of the apartment sank into darkness. He wrote figures on scrap paper, crossed them out, rewrote them again. Rent, utilities, food, gas, school supplies. There was no room left for mistakes. Rent was due again soon. The landlord had already hinted at an increase. Nothing aggressive, just a reminder that the world was moving forward, whether he could keep up or not. Buying the cabin meant spending nearly all of it in one decision. No safety net afterward. No backup plan. No one to call if it went wrong. People later said that was reckless. But they hadn't been there, staring at the same numbers night after night, watching the options disappear one by one. Rent was predictable, but it never ended. Ownership was risky, but it offered something rent never could: permanence. The cabin wasn't a dream. It was a calculation. A flawed one, perhaps, but the only one that still made sense. He thought about his son, asleep in the next room, shoes lined neatly by the door because they never stayed long enough anywhere to leave them scattered. He thought about how many times the boy had asked, quietly, if they were moving again. Buying the cabin wouldn't fix everything. He knew that. It wouldn't erase the past or guarantee an easier future. But it would mean one thing he hadn't been able to give his child in years. Staying. No landlord. No notices taped to the door. No packing boxes stacked by the wall. Just a place that was theirs, no matter how broken it looked. He didn't tell many people about the decision. Not because he was hiding it, but because explaining it required an energy he no longer had. Some choices are easier to make when they remain private, unchallenged by opinions that come too late to help. When the day came to sign the papers, the process felt almost anticlimactic. The seller barely made eye contact. There was no small talk, no nostalgia about the property. Just signatures, a handshake that felt more like relief than congratulations, and a set of old keys that looked as tired as the cabin itself. As he walked out, keys heavy in his palm, a thought crossed his mind, brief, unwelcome, but impossible to ignore. If this was a mistake, there would be no way to undo it. He didn't push the thought away. He accepted it. Because sometimes, when life has taken almost everything from you, the last thing you can afford is fear. News travels quickly in small circles. He hadn't intended to make an announcement. He mentioned the cabin casually, The way people mention any practical decision, without drama, without expectation. But it didn't take long before the reactions came, one after another, each revealing more about the speaker than the place itself. Some laughed. Not cruelly, not outright, just enough to make the point clear. A cabin, in the woods, with a kid. They shook their heads the way people do when they believe they're watching someone make a mistake they themselves were lucky enough to avoid. It wasn't mockery so much as disbelief, the quiet kind that settles in after someone has already decided the outcome. Others tried to be helpful. They leaned in closer, lowered their voices, shared stories they had heard secondhand, details that grew darker with each retelling. They said the cabin had been empty for a reason. They said no one ever stayed long. They said repairs never seemed to hold. One man, older than most, hesitated before speaking at all. When he finally did, his voice was careful. "I'd think about it," he said. "Some places don't want to be lived in." The word stayed with him longer than the rest. Warnings have a way of doing that, especially when they come without explanation. He asked questions when he could. Not many people had answers. Some changed the subject. Others shrugged and admitted they didn't really know. They had just heard things. Whispers. Half-remembered conversations from years ago. No one could tell him exactly why the cabin had been abandoned, only that it had been. The seller had been no more helpful. There was no history offered, no stories of family gatherings or summer evenings on the porch. Just a transaction completed with visible relief, as though passing the responsibility to someone else had been the goal all along. That unsettled him more than the warnings. People usually cling to places that once mattered to them. Even when they sell, there's often a pause, a look back, something. Here, there had been nothing. Still, the laughter didn't change the math. The warnings didn't lower the rent elsewhere. Regret, imagined or real, didn't offer alternatives. He reminded himself of that whenever doubt crept in. Everyone who questioned the decision had a roof over their head. Everyone who advised caution had options. It was easy to be careful when the consequences weren't yours to carry. His son listened quietly to these conversations, pretending not to. Children always do. He never asked if the cabin was a bad idea. He never repeated the jokes he heard. He simply watched his father more closely than before, measuring his mood, absorbing the weight of adult uncertainty. On the drive to the cabin for the first time as its owner, the road seemed longer than he remembered. Each mile pulled them further away from familiarity and deeper into something unknown. The trees thickened. The air grew still. The radio lost its signal entirely. For a moment, just one, regret rose sharply enough to catch his breath. Not fear of the cabin itself. Fear of having chosen wrong when someone else depended on him. Then the thought passed. Regret is loud when it has nothing to compete with. But responsibility has a way of quieting it. As the cabin came into view, worn and waiting just as it had been before, he felt something unexpected settle in his chest. Not confidence, not relief, resolve. The laughter had already faded. The warnings had been heard. Whatever regret might come later would come on his own terms. For now, there was work to do, and a place, however unwanted, that needed them as much as they needed it. Living in the cabin was nothing like moving into a home. There were no boxes neatly unpacked, no moment where things suddenly felt settled. Only a long series of small adjustments, each one demanding more patience than the last. The first night was the hardest. The cold arrived early, seeping through the walls as if the cabin itself had forgotten how to keep warmth inside. The wood stove worked, but poorly, its heat uneven and unreliable. They slept fully clothed, blankets layered one over another, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the woods pressing in from all sides. The cabin creaked constantly, not sharply, not threateningly, just enough to remind them that nothing here was solid yet. His son lay awake longer than usual, eyes open in the dark. When he finally spoke, his voice was small but steady. "Is it always this loud?" His father considered the question carefully before answering. "It's just the house," he said. "Old places have a lot to say." The boy nodded, accepting the explanation the way children do when they trust the person giving it. He turned on his side and eventually fell asleep, one hand tucked under his pillow, the other resting where he could feel the steady reassurance of his father nearby. Days followed a simple rhythm. Mornings began early. The light filtered in unevenly through the windows that weren't boarded shut, dust floating visibly in the air. Breakfast was quiet and repetitive, whatever could be made with limited supplies and no expectation of variety. Afterward came the work. Loose boards had to be nailed down, gaps in the walls stuffed with insulation where they could afford it, cloth where they couldn't. Leaks patched temporarily, knowing they would need attention again when the rain returned. The cabin resisted improvement. Every repair uncovered another problem. Fixing one section of wall revealed rot in another. Replacing a plank exposed nails so old they bent instead of pulling free. Progress came slowly, measured in inches rather than steps. He worked while his son helped in small ways, holding tools, sweeping debris, handing over nails one at a time. The boy took the tasks seriously, concentrating harder than necessary, proud to be useful. In the evenings, they ate by the light of a single lamp. The shadows it cast were long and unfamiliar, stretching across walls that still bore the marks of past neglect. Sometimes the wind rattled the boards hard enough to pause conversation altogether. Yet for all its discomfort, the cabin offered something they had not had in a long time. Privacy. No footsteps overhead. No voices through thin walls. No reminders that they were temporary guests in someone else's space. Here, no one told them when to leave. He noticed changes in his son first. The boy slept more soundly after the first few nights. He began leaving his shoes by the door without lining them up perfectly, as if testing whether they would still be there in the morning. He explored the area around the cabin, careful but curious, learning which paths led nowhere and which returned him safely home. They were not comfortable, but they were staying. Still, the cabin had its moods. Some rooms felt colder than others, no matter how much heat they tried to push into them. One corner of the living space remained stubbornly dark, the light seeming to dull as it reached that part of the wall. He found himself avoiding it without quite knowing why. At night, when the house settled and the woods grew quiet, he sometimes lay awake listening. Not for animals, not for danger, for something else he couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear, it was awareness. The sense that the cabin was older than its appearance suggested. That it had been built with intention, not carelessly, not cheaply, and then abandoned without explanation. He dismissed the thoughts during the day, when work kept his hands busy and his mind grounded. But they returned at night, uninvited, lingering just long enough to make him wonder. The cabin had been unwanted. That much was clear. What wasn't clear was why. It began with details so small they could have been dismissed entirely. A sound beneath the floorboards that didn't match the rest of the cabin's familiar creaks. Not the long groan of settling wood, but a dull, hollow echo that returned only in one narrow strip of the living area. He noticed it the first time he dragged a heavy table across the room. The noise changed halfway through, deepening, as if the ground beneath that section answered differently. He paused, listening. Then he shrugged and kept working. Old houses were full of oddities. Everyone knew that. A few days later, while replacing a damaged section of wall, he realized how thick it was. Thicker than necessary. He measured it twice, then again, convinced he had made a mistake. The studs were spaced unevenly, reinforced in places that didn't carry weight. Whoever built the cabin had gone to extra effort where none seemed required. He told himself it was over-engineering. A cautious builder. Nothing more. But the details kept coming. One evening, his son found something wedged behind a loose board near the back of the cabin. A scrap of paper, brittle with age, folded so many times it barely held together. There was no writing on it, just faint lines, as if something had been sketched and erased repeatedly, leaving behind the memory of an idea rather than the idea itself. "What is it?" the boy asked. "Probably nothing," he said, and believed it, at least in that moment. Later, he noticed a small metal latch high on the wall of a storage nook. It served no purpose he could see. It didn't open anything. It didn't hold anything closed. It was simply there, old and rusted, fastened carefully into the wood as if it once mattered a great deal. He began to pay attention in a way he hadn't before. When the wind blew, Some walls seemed to respond more solidly than others. When rain fell, water ran down the outside of the cabin unevenly, pooling briefly at one spot before disappearing, as if guided. The floor near the darker corner he had avoided earlier felt colder underfoot, even after hours of heat. None of it proved anything, and yet, taken together, the cabin felt less accidental. He asked around again, carefully this time. Not broad questions, specific ones. About the construction, about the owner, about when repairs had last been made. The answers were vague. Most people couldn't remember. Some claimed the cabin had always been that way. A few suggested changes had been made a long time ago, then quickly moved on. No one offered details. One afternoon, while clearing debris from beneath the porch, he found nails that didn't match the rest of the structure. Newer, stronger, driven in with purpose. They had no reason to be there, holding nothing together, reinforcing nothing. He sat back on his heels, turning one of them between his fingers, and felt a quiet tightening in his chest. The cabin hadn't simply aged. It had been altered. That realization did not bring excitement. It brought caution. That night, after his son had gone to sleep, he walked through the cabin slowly, touching walls, pressing gently where the wood sounded different. He moved without tools, without a plan, guided only by the sense that something here had been arranged deliberately and then left behind. When he finally stopped, it was in front of the darker section of the living area. He stood there for a long time, listening to the low, steady hum of the forest outside. Nothing moved, nothing revealed itself. And yet, for the first time since arriving, he felt certain of one thing. The cabin wasn't hiding its secrets from him. It was waiting. He did not act on the feeling right away. That more than anything was what defined him. He was not impulsive. Life had trained him to pause, to weigh consequences before moving forward. When mistakes were expensive, hesitation became a form of survival. So for several days, he did nothing. He went back to routine repairs, fixed what was broken, ignored the darker corner of the room as best he could, told himself that suspicion, like fear, grew stronger the more attention it received. But the cabin did not let the matter rest. Every time he crossed that section of the floor, the sound returned, soft, hollow, unmistakably different. Every time he leaned against that wall, it felt colder than the rest, as if it resisted the warmth he tried to push into it. The more he worked around it, the clearer it became that this part of the cabin had been constructed separately, deliberately. One evening, while measuring wall space for shelving, he noticed something that stopped him completely. The measurements didn't add up. The exterior of the cabin suggested a larger interior space than what existed. It wasn't much, perhaps a foot, maybe a little more, but it was enough to matter. Enough to mean that somewhere between the outer wall and the inner room, something had been taken away, or added. He checked again, then a third time. The numbers didn't change. He stood there quietly, tape measure dangling from his hand, listening to the steady breathing of his son asleep in the next room. This was no longer about curiosity. It was about responsibility. If something had been hidden here, he needed to know what it was. Not for himself, but for the child sleeping under this roof. He waited until morning. The next day, after walking his son to the edge of the clearing and watching him disappear down the path he'd learned to follow safely, he returned to the cabin alone. He gathered tools slowly, deliberately. A pry bar, a hammer, nothing heavy, nothing violent. He started carefully, removing a section of paneling near the floor where repairs had already exposed weakness. The wood came away easier than he expected. Behind it was another layer, older, darker, reinforced with metal strips that had no structural purpose. That was when he saw it. A seam, perfectly straight, perfectly vertical, hidden behind years of dust and paint. A line where two surfaces met that should never have existed in a wall meant to hold up a house. His breath caught, not in excitement, but in recognition. Someone had built this. Not repaired it, not reinforced it, built it. He stepped back, heart steady but heavy, and considered his next move. He could stop, seal it back up, pretend he had never noticed. But some truths, once seen, refused to be ignored. He worked slowly, removing more paneling, exposing a flat metal surface beneath. Cold to the touch. Solid. Unmistakable. A door. No handle. No hinges visible. No markings of any kind. Just a smooth slab of metal set into the structure of the cabin as if it had always belonged there. He sat down on the floor in front of it, tools resting at his side, and stayed there longer than he meant to. This wasn't what he had expected to find when he bought a broken house in the woods. Whatever lay beyond that door had been hidden with intention. And for the first time since stepping onto the property, he felt something he had not felt before. Not hope, not fear, respect for whatever decision had been made to keep this space closed. When his son returned that afternoon, the paneling was back in place. The wall looked exactly as it had before. The tools were put away. Dinner was made. Homework was done. Nothing appeared different. But that night, as the cabin settled around them and the woods grew quiet once more, he lay awake knowing that the cabin held more than rot and neglect. It held a boundary, and sooner or later, he would have to decide whether to cross it. He waited longer than he needed to, not because he was afraid of what he might find, but because some decisions deserve time, the kind of time that allows doubt to settle, to prove whether it belongs or not. Days passed, then another week. The cabin returned to its routines, and for a while, the hidden wall stayed just that, hidden. But the knowledge of it never left. It followed him through the day, quiet but present. While he worked, while he cooked, while he listened to his son talk about school and the small discoveries children make when the world still feels manageable. At night, when the house finally grew still, the thought returned with more clarity than emotion. Whatever was behind that door had been placed there intentionally. An intention always carries responsibility. He chose a morning when his son would be away longer than usual. Not out of secrecy, but caution. If something unexpected happened, a child should not be there to witness it. The paneling came off more easily the second time. The metal surface beneath it caught the light immediately, unmarked, unornamented, as if it had never been meant to draw attention. Up close, he could see faint scratches, not from age, but from use. Someone had opened this door before, more than once. There was no handle, but there was a small recessed slot near the edge. He tried it gently. Nothing moved. He checked the surrounding wall, then the floor beneath it. That was when he noticed a section of baseboard that didn't quite match the rest. It sat a fraction of an inch higher, secured with screws newer than anything else in the cabin. He removed it carefully. Behind it was a simple mechanical latch, old but well-maintained. No electronics. No modern safeguards. Just a design meant to last, meant to work long after its creator was gone. When the latch finally released, the sound it made was soft, almost respectful. The door shifted inward a few inches, stopping on its own as if testing whether it was still welcome to open. He did not rush. He widened the opening slowly, the metal moving with more ease than expected. Behind it was darkness, not the kind that suggests emptiness, but the kind that absorbs light. He stepped back and waited for his eyes to adjust. What he saw first was not wealth. It was order. The space beyond the door was small, no larger than a walk-in closet, but had been finished with care. The walls were lined with shelving, sturdy and deliberate. Everything inside had been placed with intention, arranged to be accessed again someday. There were boxes, wooden, sealed, their edges worn smooth by time. There were metal cases stacked neatly along the back wall. And in the center of the space sat a heavy safe, older than anything he'd ever seen, its surface scarred but intact. The air inside was cool and dry, preserved. This was not a hiding place built in haste. This was not a panic decision. Someone had planned this. He did not touch anything at first. He simply stood there, absorbing the weight of what he was seeing. The space carried no sense of danger, no immediate threat. Instead, it felt like a paused moment, something frozen mid-thought, waiting for resolution. When he finally reached out, it was not for the safe. It was for one of the boxes. The wood was heavier than expected. Inside, wrapped carefully in layers of cloth that had once been white, were stacks of paper. Documents. Old envelopes. Ledgers written in a careful hand. The ink had faded, but the intention behind it had not. Dates stretched back decades. Names appeared more than once. This was history, not clutter. Only after that did he turn his attention to the metal cases. One opened with a soft click, revealing rows of items that caught the light even in the dim space. He closed it immediately, heart steady but mind alert. He did not need to count to understand value. The safe remained closed. Some things, he knew, deserved distance until you were ready to face their meaning. He sealed the door again before leaving the space, replacing the paneling just as carefully as he had removed it. The cabin returned to its familiar shape, but it no longer felt the same. That evening, as he sat across from his son at the small table they shared, he realized something that surprised him. He was not excited. He was calm. Whatever had been hidden in that cabin for decades had waited long enough. And now that it had been found, it demanded not celebration, but care. Finding the hidden room answered one question. It raised many others. The cabin no longer felt anonymous. It felt authored. Someone had imagined it this way. Someone had chosen the thickness of the walls, the placement of the shelves, the kind of latch that would outlast trends and technology. The care embedded in the construction suggested a builder who valued patience over speed and permanence over appearances. He began where most people do when they're trying to understand the past. He asked questions, not loudly, not insistently, just enough to learn who had owned the land before it became a rumor. Records at the county office were thin, the kind that left more gaps than answers. The property had changed hands infrequently, always quietly, often through intermediaries. Taxes paid on time. No liens. No disputes. One name appeared more than once. An older man. A private man. Someone who had lived alone and kept to himself. He had purchased the land decades earlier, back when it was cheaper and more easily overlooked. According to the paperwork, he had built the cabin himself, or overseen its construction closely. There were no photographs on file, no mention of family, no clear explanation for why the property had eventually been abandoned. He spoke to people who had lived nearby long enough to remember. Most recalled the man only vaguely. He was polite, they said, quiet, the kind of neighbor who nodded but didn't linger. He drove an unremarkable truck, bought supplies and cash, asked few questions and answered fewer. He didn't want trouble, one woman remembered, and he didn't want attention. Others mentioned his habits. He repaired things instead of replacing them. He avoided gatherings. He came and went at odd hours. Nothing about it sounded criminal. It sounded cautious. One man, older still, hesitated before speaking. He leaned back in his chair and studied the floor as if weighing whether memory was worth the effort. There was a time, he said finally, when people thought he had more money than he should. Not rich, not flashy, just inconsistent. He lived simply, dressed plainly, yet he paid for materials outright, hired help when needed, then dismissed them quickly. And once, years earlier, he had renovated part of the cabin after everyone assumed construction was finished. No one knew why, the man said. We figured he'd changed his mind. The renovations matched what had been found behind the wall. The timeline fit. The man had not vanished suddenly. There had been no police reports, no public investigation. He had simply stopped being seen. Mail piled up for a while. Then it stopped coming altogether. Eventually, the property was sold off quietly, stripped of context and story. The cabin had outlived its creator. What unsettled him most was not the secrecy, but the discipline. Whatever the man had been protecting, he had done so without drawing attention, without boasting, without leaving behind anything that demanded explanation. It suggested a motive rooted not in greed, but in caution. Back at the cabin, he returned to the documents he had found. He read them slowly, carefully, resisting the urge to jump ahead. Dates aligned with events he remembered only vaguely from the news. Transactions noted without commentary. Accounts tracked with precision, as if meant to be audited someday by someone who had earned the right to know. This was not a hoard. It was a record, a decision carried forward year after year to keep something safe, not hidden forever, but hidden until it could be handled responsibly. He closed the box and sat quietly for a long time. The man who built the cabin had not trusted institutions. He had not trusted people, but he had trusted time. And time, it seemed, had finally chosen its moment. Knowing something exists is not the same as understanding what it means. For days after learning more about the man who built the cabin, he did nothing with what he had found. He resisted the urge to count, to estimate, to imagine. Experience had taught him that rushing toward conclusions often created more problems than it solved. Instead, he sought clarity. He contacted a lawyer, not someone recommended by friends, but someone whose reputation was built on caution rather than speed. Their first meeting was brief and understated. No dramatic reactions, no wide eyes, just careful questions and long pauses. "What exactly do you have?" the lawyer asked. "Documents," he said. "Assets, records, and a safe." The lawyer nodded, as if this were not the first time a life had quietly shifted across a desk. They went through everything slowly. Each document was examined, cross-referenced, dated. Each record matched an account, an institution, a transaction that still existed somewhere in the system. Some assets had been dormant. Others had grown quietly over time, untouched and unnoticed. The numbers added up. Then they were checked again. The lawyer finally leaned back in his chair, hands folded, expression neutral. "You're not looking at a few $100,000, he said. "And you're not looking at something contested." He paused. "This is worth several $1,000,000. The words landed without drama. No sudden rush of relief. No surge of excitement. Just a heavy stillness. Money had never meant freedom to him. It had meant time. It had meant breathing room. It had meant not having to choose between necessities. Now it meant something else entirely. Responsibility. The assets were clean, legally transferred, protected by time and the absence of claims. Whatever the original owner had intended, he had structured it carefully enough that the person who found it, who now owned the property, could also own what it contained. "This doesn't happen often," the lawyer said. "But when it does, it's usually because someone planned for it." He thought of the man who built the cabin. The patience, the discipline, the trust placed not in people, but in process. When he returned home, the cabin felt different again. Not lighter, not grander, just quieter. He walked through the rooms, noticing things he hadn't before. The way the light fell across the table. The worn spot on the floor where his son sat to tie his shoes. The marks on the wall from early repairs, left unfinished but honest. That evening, his son talked about school, about a book he was reading, about a question he hadn't known how to answer in class. He listened the way he always had, fully, without distraction. Nothing had changed for the boy yet, and that mattered. He did not tell anyone else right away. Not friends, not family, not the people who had laughed or warned or offered advice when it cost them nothing. He had learned enough to know that money attracts noise, and noise complicates things that are still settling into place. That night, as he sat alone after his son had gone to bed, he opened the safe for the first time. He did not count what was inside. He closed it again, because the truth he had just learned was already more than enough. Change does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives sideways, through tone, through timing, through the way people begin to speak differently once they sense the ground has shifted beneath them. He did not tell anyone what he had found. Not directly, not deliberately. But information has a way of moving on its own, especially in places where people watch closely and talk carefully. The first signs were subtle. A neighbor who had once laughed off the cabin now lingered longer at the fence line. A former acquaintance reached out just to check in, their voice warmer than it used to be. A relative who had been distant suddenly remembered birthdays, asked questions, suggested visits. Nothing was said outright. Nothing needed to be. People sensed opportunity the way animals sense weather. He noticed it, but he did not respond. There was no satisfaction in watching opinions change. No sense of victory in being treated differently for reasons that had nothing to do with character. If anything, it reinforced a lesson he had learned long before the cabin ever entered his life. Respect given late is rarely respect at all. One afternoon, a man who had warned him most strongly against buying the property stopped by. He stood awkwardly on the porch, hands in his pockets, eyes avoiding the places where repairs had clearly been made. "Looks better than I expected," he said. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't admiration. It was an adjustment. They spoke briefly. About weather. About work. About nothing in particular. When the man left, He did so with a nod that carried less certainty than before. Inside, his son watched from the table. "Why do people keep coming by now?" the boy asked. He considered the question. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "people pay attention only after something changes." The boy nodded, accepting the answer without pushing further. Children often understand more than they're given credit for. They just don't feel the need to prove it. There were offers, too. Help with repairs. Advice on investments. Suggestions that came too quickly to be sincere. He declined them all politely. Not out of pride, not out of spite, but because the cabin had already taught him something essential. The work that matters is done quietly, and the rewards that last don't need witnesses. He continued living much as he had before. He fixed what needed fixing. He planned carefully. He moved money only when he understood exactly why. There were no sudden purchases, no visible upgrades, no announcements meant to correct old opinions. The people who had doubted him watched, confused. They expected change to look a certain way, to arrive loudly, to demand acknowledgement. When it didn't, they lost interest. And that was fine, because the real shift was happening where no one else could see it. His son no longer asked if they would have to move. Shoes stayed by the door because they belonged there. Plans extended further into the future than a single season. The cabin remained quiet. The woods remained indifferent. And the karma people expected, dramatic, public, satisfying, never came. Instead, something else took its place. Stability, dignity, and the calm certainty that the life he was building did not require permission from anyone who had doubted it. In the end, it wasn't the money that changed his life. That was the part people assumed mattered most. The part they whispered about. The part they imagined would fix everything that had once been broken. But money, he learned, does not repair what time has worn down. It only gives you the space to decide what truly deserves saving. The cabin remained modest. It did not become a showpiece. It did not grow larger or more impressive. It was repaired, not transformed. The roof no longer leaked. The stove worked as it should. The walls held warmth instead of cold. Small changes done carefully with intention. The kind of work that makes a place livable without erasing its past. Some rooms stayed simple by choice. Some marks were left untouched. Not out of nostalgia, but respect. The cabin had carried too much history to be stripped down to something generic. What offered him instead was time. Time to say no. Time to plan. Time to breathe without counting every minute. And time, he discovered, was the rarest form of wealth. His son grew into the space the cabin allowed, not just physically, but quietly in ways that mattered. Confidence arrived without ceremony. Questions about the future replaced worries about tomorrow. The boy learned that stability did not have to be loud to be real. They talked more in the evenings. About books. About ideas. About the kind of life he wanted to build someday. Not urgently, not fearfully, but with patience. That alone was worth more than anything hidden behind the walls. Sometimes, late at night, he thought about the man who had built the cabin. He imagined him working alone, planning carefully, choosing silence over exposure. A man who had understood something many people never do, that the safest place for certain truths is not public admiration, but time itself. The cabin had not been abandoned. It had been entrusted, and somehow, against all probability, it had found its way into the hands of someone who understood what that meant. Years later, when people spoke of the place, they spoke differently. Not with curiosity, not with suspicion, but with quiet acceptance. It was no longer the cabin no one wanted. It was simply a home. As for him, he never corrected the stories people told. He never explained how close he had come to walking away, or how easily the outcome could have been different. Some truths do not lose value when they remain untold. They gain it, because the cabin had never promised comfort or certainty. What it gave him was something far more lasting. A life no longer shaped by fear. A future no longer defined by loss. And the knowledge that sometimes the greatest rewards are hidden, not to test greed, but to find those who have learned how to carry them. And if he had walked away like everyone else had, the cabin would have waited. Because some stories are not meant to be claimed quickly. They are meant to be earned.